Witch's Sister by Phyllis Reynolds Naylor, Chapter 2. Mrs. Morley came home for lunch with the announcement that her studio was in order, the books in their proper places, the envelopes and paper, stamps, erasers, pencils, ballpoint pens, and notepads arranged just so, and there was no reason on earth why she couldn't get to work on her half-written book immediately. Whenever Mother said there was no reason on earth, it meant she was having trouble with the plot. Stevie was up now, eating a bowl of sugar crisps. He looked like a little mother. Both their faces were round, and their blue eyes were spaced wide apart. Lynn was the only one who looked like her father, and that's why she never cared for mirrors. Not that Father was ugly. His looks went well on him, but they weren't so great on a girl. "Why don't you write a book about dinosaurs?" Stevie asked, burrowing his spoon down deep in the cereal and filling his mouth to overflowing. "Because I don't know any dinosaurs," Mrs. Morley said matter-of-factly. She was putting a new shoelace in Stevie's sneaker between bites of her sandwich. "As soon as I write about something I don't know anything about, something I can scarcely even imagine, I know right away that the book can't be any good. If I wrote a story about a dinosaur, it would look like a dog, behave like a horse, and have a boy's name. And who would believe a dinosaur like that?" "Write about that time when you were a girl and got lost in Milwaukee," Lynn suggested, but Mrs. Morley shook her head. "That's just not the way an idea comes. It's nothing anyone can give me. It has to start inside my own head. I have to stumble it myself and know that it's meant for me. Right now, I have little wispy things in my mind, little fragments of a story that hasn't put itself together yet, pages that are disconnected. It will come, but sometimes it's hard waiting." "I'm sure not going to be an author and write in a hen house," Judith said from her chair on the back porch, where she was eating alone. "I want to be something really different. Haunting. Something dreamy." "There aren't too many opportunities to be dreamy, my dear," Mrs. Morley told her, putting Stevie's shoe on for him and tying it. "No matter what you decide to be, it's going to have its gringy moments." She got up and gave her brown hair a quick combing in the mirror over the sink. "Okay, I'm off. See you around 4. She started outside and then stuck her head back in. "I've got a new shovel for you, Stevie. It's on the back porch." Stevie went out to play in the sand at the side of the house, and Lynn watched him for a while from the window seat in the music room. The baby fat on his chubby legs dimpled as he squatted there in the sand. His lips puckered as he worked at digging a tunnel for his trucks. Lynn could remember when Judith had enjoyed playing with him. Now she was all wrapped up in herself. The phone rang. It was Mouse. Lynn sprawled on the cool oak floor in the hallway, the receiver to her ear. "What's up?" she asked. "Chapter 1, page 7, came Marjorie's voice over the wire. "The ability of witches to perform tremendous feats as a result of their combined psychic efforts when gathered together as a coven. This is called raising the cone of power. Though the traditional number is 7, a group consisting of no more than 2 or 3 sometimes considers itself a coven." Mouse stopped for breath, and Lynn took over. "You see, Mouse," she whispered, "if a witch has even one more person to work with, her power is stronger. Right, page 10. In the 16th century, witches rubbed their bodies with an ointment made of thorn, apples, belladonna, parsley, and the fat of an unbaptized infant." Lynn gasped. "They have also been accused of making pacts with the devil and riding on broomsticks greased with boiled-down babies." There was the sound of Stevie's crying outside, punctuated by little shrieks. Just a minute, Mouse," Lynn said and raced to the back door. Judith was coming across the yard, holding Stevie by one arm. "Will you please keep him home?" Judith said to Lynn. "He's your responsibility for this afternoon, and I don't want him following me around." "I just want to go swimming too," Stevie wailed. "Judith's going. I want to swim too." "Wait till I get through talking with Mouse and I'll take you down to the creek," Lynn promised, noting the red marks on his arm where Judith had squeezed it. They did not look like ordinary marks somehow, but had the appearance of scratches made by claws. "Please just wait till I'm through," Judith demanded. "Can't I even have a little privacy?" She turned and flounced back across the lawn, through Mother's garden, and out into the field toward Cowden's Creek, beach towel flapping over her arm. Come on in the kitchen and I'll give you a glass of Kool-Aid, Lynn said. We'll go swimming later when Judith gets back. When Stevie had calmed down, Lynn went back to the telephone. It was Stevie and Judith, she said uneasily. I know, Mouse told her. I could hear Judith yelling, Listen, Lynn, I've got to ask. Is Stevie baptized? I don't know, Lynn said. Oh, no! The fat of an unbaptized infant. But maybe it doesn't matter if the fat is 5 years old. Oh, Mouse, she wouldn't, Lynn declared. I mean, I know he gets in her way and everything, but... Okay, it was just an idea. I'm going to start chapter 2 now. See you later. An hour later, Judith came back from the creek. She brushed past Lynn and slowly ascended the stairs to her room on the 3rd floor, crooning her strange little tune. Lynn broke out in goosebumps, and when she looked down, she saw the same marks on her own arm she had seen on Stevie's. Mrs. Morley had been in the hen house for 1 week and hadn't written as much as a paragraph that she hadn't crossed out later. I don't know what's the matter, she said one evening. I just can't latch hold of the plot. I think I've got it, and then it's gone again. Nothing hangs together. She was trying to braid Lynn's hair in a fancy style that hung down her back, but Lynn doubted it would make her beautiful. Father moved the rook on the chessboard in front of him and studied the position for a while. His long fingers rested lightly on the piece, and his narrow face widened in a smile. Seems like the moment you moved in the hen house, you laid an egg, he quipped. I don't find that amusing, Richard, Mother said. Whenever she called Father Richard, she was really upset. I know, sweetheart, but you'll have to admit you work in rather odd surroundings. They're perfectly fine surroundings. The studio is comfortable and convenient, and I wish you would all stop harassing me about it. When you have problems with your work, do I tell you to get yourself another office? No, can't say that you do. Then let's face it, the trouble is me. Mother vigorously brushed out a braid and tried something else. Lynn sat still, enjoying it. I stare at the typewriter and it stares back at me, and the paper just sits there going nowhere. Maybe I wasn't meant to be a writer, she said darkly. Maybe I ought to do something else. I think you're working too hard at it, Father suggested. You ought to forget about it for a while and just let it come spontaneously. This isn't the first time you've hit a block, you know, but you always seem to pull through. He moved a piece on the chessboard. Check, he said to himself, and rested his chin in his hands. Mother's nimble fingers plied Lynn's hair high on her head, with 2 curls on either side, and handed her the mirror. Not bad. Not bad, Lynn thought, pleased. I could turn that hen's house into a bakery and sell muffins, pies, and cobblers, and I could publish recipe books and historical notes about Indiana. What do you think, Dick? I think it makes a nice pipe dream till you get your new book going again, said Father. I think it's a great idea, Stevie put in from the dining room where he was building a Tinker Toy masterpiece. Oh, Mother, you always say that, Lynn reminded her. When I was 7 years old, you said if you couldn't write, you'd sell homemade bread, remember? Mr. Morley swooped one big hand over the board, confiscated all the pieces, and set up a new chess problem. Lynn, you ought to know by now that your mother isn't happy unless she's creating something. Before she even started creating children, she was creating books. And if the well ever runs dry, you can bet she'll be creating something else. Please don't refer to my head as a well, Mother said. You'll have me worrying about a water shortage. Mr. Morley grinned. You know that'll never happen, Sylvia. Writing's in your blood. I knew that when I married you. You're never happier and nicer to be around than when you're deep in a story and it's going fine. And when it's not and the ideas won't come? Exactly. All right, Mother promised. I'll not even think about the book for a few days. I'll go make a blueberry cobbler instead. I want to help with the crust, Stevie said, and danced out to the kitchen behind her. Dad, Lynn asked, holding her head very still so the curls wouldn't fall down. Is Stevie baptized? Mr. Morley didn't even look up. No, our church doesn't do things that way. We dedicate children, but we don't baptize them. Why? Just wondering, Lynn said. She just wished Stevie didn't have so much baby fat, that's all. There was a picnic on the weekend, and Mrs. Morley abandoned herself to the joy of the moment. If she thought about her book, she didn't show it, and Lynn especially enjoyed these close times with her mother. Like mountain goats, the Morleys climbed single file up the steep trails to the state park, pointing out sights below and yelping with delight whenever they spotted a nest, or a snake, or a jackrabbit hurtling itself over the brambles. Even Judith snapped out of her lethargy for the day and smiled at Father's teasing, as though getting away from the neighborhood broke the spell somehow. "What's the matter, Judith? Got lead in your boots?" Mr. Morley asked as she dragged behind, exhausted from the long climb up to the lookout point. "It's not fair," Judith said, laughing. "You and Lynn have the only long legs in the family. I have to take 2 steps for every one of yours." Lynn couldn't believe it. Judith actually envied something of hers. It gave Lynn a warm feeling of closeness toward her sister. Judith was even thoughtful. "One marshmallow left, Lynn. You want it?" she asked as she toasted the last in the sack. "Sure, any time," Lynn said. And when the marshmallows were gone and the lunch had been cleared away, Judith took Stevie over to the swings and swung a long time with him on her lap. "Oh, what a marvelous day," Mother said, walking back to the car with her arm around Lynn, the wind blowing her hair about her face. I feel utterly uncrinkled. Let's do this again before the summer's over." They rode back home, Stevie in the front beside his father, and Mrs. Morley in the back with the girls. Lynn started, "White coral bells," and Mother and Judith joined in. They did "Row, row, row your boat," and all the other rounds they could think of. Sitting there beside Judith, Lynn felt she'd probably been very wrong about her sister. Maybe now she was going to be friendly the way she used to be, when they would all lie in bed, talking long after the lights were out, and Judith would tell all her secrets. But as soon as they reached home, as soon as Judith started up the steps, in fact, the mood came over her again. She went up to her room and drew the curtain, and when Lynn asked if she could come in, Judith said no, she was reading. There was no sound of pages turning, however, and as Lynn lay in her bed on the other side of the curtain almost asleep, she thought she heard the faint tinkle of a bell, or perhaps it was only Judith's wind chime. On Monday evening, Judith left earlier than usual for Mrs. Tuggles, and Lynn realized how little she herself had seen of the old woman. What she had seen, however, she remembered surprisingly well. Somehow she seemed to have an accurate memory for storing away odds and ends, and she had only to close her eyes to picture Mrs. Tuggle vividly. She was a short woman, an inch shorter than Judith, with a frail little body and bony shoulders that protruded up under the sleeves of her dress like 2 metal doorknobs. Her hair was gray and wound into a small, tight bun at the back of her head, but her eyebrows were dark black, as though they had been taken from another face and pasted above her eyes. There was something about Mrs. Tuggle's large jaws, however, that gave her a look of strength, as though hidden inside the small, frail woman was a person of unusual power. She had come to Indiana years ago from Castletown in England, and though she had long since given up tea and biscuits in the late afternoon, she still spoke with a lilting British accent. The few times Lynn had visited her, Mrs. Tuggle's talk had soon turned to the thatch-roofed cottages and hedgerows she loved so much, to haunted castles and fog above the cliffs and the ghosts that roamed the moors. "Just her way of whiling away the long winter evenings," Mother always said of her stories. "And anyway, aren't they marvelous? And the little verses she knows?" But the more Lynn thought about that night, the clearer it all became. Wasn't it about the time that Judith began going to Mrs. Tuggles that her strangeness began? Wasn't that about the time the girls were making fudge and Lynn's burned, but Judith's didn't? That Lynn got the 24-hour flu, but Judith didn't? That Lynn had 3 cavities and Judith, for the first time, had none? Wouldn't such tricks as these be appropriate for a beginning witch? Who really knew very much about the little woman high on the hill in the oldest house of all? Wasn't it Mrs. Tuggle herself who had suggested that Mother use her hen house as a studio, that Judith come by for sewing lessons? Maybe Mrs. Tuggle was spinning her web, and Judith had been the first to get trapped. What does Judith do there all that time? Lynn asked her mother. "She's making a wardrobe for school. Mrs. Tuggle is an excellent seamstress, and it will be wonderful if Judith learns to sew as well as she does. Besides, Mrs. Tuggle's lonely. It's good for her to have a young girl about, and she and Judith seem to get along nicely together." It was obvious that Mother suspected nothing. "Mouse," said Lynn over the phone on Tuesday. "Can you come by this evening?" "Sure." "Leave your bike at home and come about 8. I'll tell you the rest later." "Right." The afternoon ticked slowly by. Judith washed her hair and lay out in a sunny place on the porch to let it dry. Lynn sat down on the glider Lynn sat down at the glider at the other end and watched her. She had to be careful, very careful. "Going to Mrs. Tuggle's tonight?" Lynn asked, innocently flipping through a magazine. Judith opened her eyes and closed them again. "I suppose." "What do you do there so long?" Lynn quizzed. "You could have made 10 skirts and a dozen blouses by now." "I'm making a pantsuit," Judith replied, "and it's hard to fit. I have to rip out half of what I make. Sometimes Mrs. Tuggle recites poetry, or else we just talk." Lynn tried not to sound too curious. "What about?" "Cabbages and kings," Judith retorted. "Now let me enjoy the quiet, please, while Stevie is out. It's like a boiler factory when he's around." Dinner came and went. Judith disappeared behind the thick curtain dividing the girls' room and emerged some time later with her blue satin box, her sewing box, she said, but no one had ever seen inside it. "Going to Mrs. Tuggle's, Mother," she called, pulling on her sandals. And when Lynn turned around, she was gone. The screen didn't even slam. Like the Wicked Witch of the East, she pulled on her slippers and simply disappeared. At 8, Lynn met Marjorie coming up from the walk below. "You know what we've got to do tonight, Mouse? Spy on Mrs. Tuggle and Judith and see what really goes on." "Ye gods," said Mouse, and sat down on the steps. "You should have told me." "Why, what difference would it make? I'd be prepared." "How?" "I'd have stayed home, that's what." Lynn sat down beside her. "Well, we can't go yet. Let's wait till it gets a little darker." She hugged herself with her arms and was surprised to discover she was shivering. "How do they do it anyway, Mouse? How do witches make spells and everything?" "It's just getting to that part." Mouse pushed back her big glasses, which kept slipping down her nose. "There are all kinds of ways. Sometimes they make sort of a doll to look like someone in particular. Then they stick pins in it and recite special words, and pretty soon the person gets sick. That's one way. Or they write the spells on a piece of paper and burn it in the flame of a candle and keep the ashes. I'll bet Judith's memorized them all by this time," Lynn said. She was quiet a while. "Mouse," she said finally, "can you imagine yourself getting involved in something like that? I mean, someone talking you into witchcraft?" "Sure, easy." "How come?" "Because I'm a coward," Mouse said simply. "All Mrs. Tuggle would have to do is look at me cross-eyed and I'd be chanting hexes. I've absolutely no backbone." "I don't believe it. It wouldn't happen unless you wanted it to." "So maybe Judith wants it. Maybe witchcraft's her career. I mean, don't knock it till you've tried it." "Oh, for goodness sake, Mouse, I've got better plans than that." "Like what?" Lynn wasn't really sure what she wanted to do. She was only sure of what she didn't want. She didn't want to be under the thumb of someone else. She wanted control over her own life. She was nobody's follower. But she was also intensely curious about other people and the choices they made. She had to know why. "Maybe I'll be a psychiatrist," she ventured. "Then I'll be your first patient," said Mouse. The Tuggle house sat at the very top of the hill, surrounded by an empty lot on each side, which Mrs. Tuggle had framed which Mr. Tuggle had framed when he was which Mr. Tuggle had farmed when he was alive. Tall trees cast their shadows on the house, and a thorn apple hid the front door completely from view. In the vast yard behind, which sloped directly down to the creek, were an old barn, a tractor shed, and the hen house. As the girls made their way up the brick sidewalk along the street, the house stood out starkly against the purple sky, its turrets and gables more fancy and numerous than any other house on the street, a gingerbread house with nothing sweet about it. There was only one light burning inside, the one in the hall, a light in the second-floor window. An upper porch extended around all three sides of the house. Like a balcony with a staircase leading down to the side yard. "We're going up," Lynn whispered in the gathering darkness, and slowly, one foot over the other, they started up, edging forward uncertainly, as though one false step would bring the porch down upon them. Each time the ancient steps creaked, the girls froze in their tracks, one foot suspended, and then, when there was no response from inside, they went on. The porch itself listed slightly toward the street, and as Lynn moved around it, she felt as if she were on a huge, silent ship, tipping slowly into the sea, breathing short breaths, lips apart. She clutched Marjorie's sleeve, heart pounding, and they inched their way to the lighted window where they could see Judith and Mrs. Tuggle inside. The old woman sat in a chair by the window, with a garment across her lap. Swiftly her fingers moved along the hem, pushing and plucking at the needle in rapid succession, like a woman born in a fitting room, and reared amid great bolts of cloth. She was talking to Judith, but so softly that Lynn could not understand her words. Judith was listening in rapt attention, hypnotized, it seemed, by the sound of the voice, and then, as Lynn watched, Judith's fingers slowly opened the blue box, lifted out a small doll in a red plaid skirt, and plunged a pin through the top of the skirt deep in the soft body of the doll. "Mouse!" Lynn breathed, too horrified to say more. Wildly the girls clung to each other there in the darkness. For another pin went into the doll, and still another. Slowly Judith turned the doll around and around, stabbing it with pins, and she handed the doll to Mrs. Tuggle and stood up. Moving swiftly backwards, away from the window, the girls fled to the top of the stairs. On silent feet, tiptoed down and ran with hearts racing across the empty lot, flinging themselves over bushes and flower beds until they collapsed, panting on the grass outside the Morleys' back porch. Judith didn't come home till after 9, but at 10 that evening the phone rang, and when Lynn answered, she heard Marjorie's weak voice saying, "Lynn, I've got an awful stomachache. How about you?" And that's the end of chapter 2.